In the 20th century, neuroscience and philosophy went their separate ways. Neuroscience became the study of the brain, and consciousness was seen as something too mysterious for science to handle. But today, with amazing new discoveries in neuroscience, we are in a unique position to bridge this divide and answer one of humanity's oldest questions: what is consciousness? And what I'm about to tell you may shock you. Neuroscience has advanced dramatically over the past decades. Today, we have unprecedented tools to image the living human brain while it's thinking. And what we've ever learned from these studies is that consciousness is nothing more than a pattern of activity in the human brain. It's a process that emerges from the complex interactions of neurons firing and communicating with each other. There is no part of the brain that contains your consciousness or houses your soul. Your consciousness is spread throughout the entire cortex. But this isn't the whole story. If consciousness is just a pattern of neural activity, then why does it feel like something? Why does it feel like there is a little voice inside your head when you think, or an image that you see when you imagine something? In other words, how do subjective experiences arise from objective brain activity? This is known as the hard problem of consciousness. And here's where philosophy comes in, because we can't answer these questions without philosophical ideas. Scientists usually think that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, but this isn't true. Our imagination, memory, and ideas also contribute greatly to our knowledge. And these things aren't found in the outside world. They're inside our heads. So to understand consciousness, we need a way of accessing this inner world, which is where philosophy can help us. I'm a professor of philosophy and Canada Research Chair in the philosophy of neuroscience at a university. Here, we use tools from both neuroscience and philosophy to study consciousness. Let me give you an example. When you hear a sound, you correctly identify its source and know what it means. For instance, you know that when you hear a siren, it means an ambulance is passing by. This is a complex cognitive process that involves many different brain areas. But all of this happens automatically. You don't have to think about what a siren is or what it means. This kind of automatic processing is a hallmark of consciousness. Now, scientists can map out all the different brain areas involved in identifying a siren, but that doesn't tell us why you believe that a siren means an ambulance. That belief is stored in your brain in a network of neurons that connects your auditory system to your semantic memory. But just because your brain has a connection from one part to another doesn't mean that you are reconscious of the connection. So to understand consciousness, we need to ask how the brain turns a pattern of neural activity into a conscious experience. And this is where philosophy and neuroscience work together. Philosophers can help us find the right questions to ask and develop the concepts and logic needed to answer them. Then neuroscientists can design experiments to test the answers. Here's another example. We often speak of our memories as being stored in our brains like files on a computer. But if you ask most neuroscientists, they'll say that this is only a metaphor. Memories aren't stored anywhere in the brain. Rather, every time you recall a memory, you reactivate the same network of neurons that first created that memory. But this raises an interesting question. If memories aren't stored anywhere, then where are they? And this is where the idea of the hard problem of consciousness comes in. You see, if there's no physical thing that corresponds to your memories, then how do you go from a pattern of neural activity to the conscious experience of remembering something? This transition from physical to phenomenal seems mysterious. It's as if a computer could suddenly become conscious of the fact that it's adding numbers, or a car could become conscious of the fact that it's driving down the road. In short, computers and cars can perform all sorts of tasks without ever becoming conscious of what they're doing. So how do we go from a computer that's just performing calculations to a human being who is conscious of those calculations? How do we go from a car that's just driving down the road to a person who is consciously driving down the road? This is the hard problem of consciousness. This is such a difficult problem that some people doubt that it can ever be solved. They say that consciousness will always remain a mystery, or that it can never be explained scientifically. But I don't think this is true. I believe that one day we'll solve this problem. But to do so, we'll need even more progress in neuroscience and even closer collaboration between neuroscientists and philosophers. But I should add that this won't be the end of the story. Every time we solve one problem, several more pop up in its place. Take, for instance, the question of how conscious experience arises from physical processes in the brain. One way to approach this problem is to say that consciousness is nothing but brain activity. On the one hand, this seems correct, because everything we know about consciousness can be explained by brain activity. On the other hand, this seems incorrect because it leaves out the subjective feeling of conscious experience. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. Imagine you have a friend who's completely dependent on his smartphone. He uses it to wake up, to find out what time it is, to set appointments, to remind him what he has to do, and to keep in touch with friends. All of his actions are determined by his smartphone. Now suppose that one day we upgrade his smartphone with a new operating system. As a result, the phone runs faster, finds better routes, sends more informative messages, but none of this affects our friend. His behavior doesn't change because he's oblivious to the changes in his phone. Something similar might be happening in our own lives. Maybe all of our conscious thoughts and experiences are nothing more than brain activity, but we don't actually experience them as brain activity. Instead, we experience them as thoughts and feelings. In this case, we would need to explain how the brain takes its own activity and transforms it into something we reconscious of. This is what we call the explanatory gap. Here's another problem that arises when we try to reduce consciousness to brain activity. Sometimes brain activity that arises from the same cause produces different conscious experiences. For instance, the burning sensation caused by touching a hot stove is produced by the same neural activity as the pain you feel when you stub your toe. But these are two very different experiences. This wouldn't happen if consciousness was nothing but brain activity. This is what we call the combination problem. So how do we solve these problems? Well, let me tell you what I believe the solution will look like. First, we'll need to discover the neural correlates of consciousness. That is, the minimal set of brain activities that are sufficient to produce any conscious experience whatsoever. It doesn't really matter what these brain activities are. They could be fast-spiking neural activity, slow cortical oscillations, or even something else entirely. The important point is that we identify a minimal set of brain activities that are both necessary and sufficient to produce consciousness. But what does it mean for a set of brain activities to be sufficient for consciousness? To answer this question, we need to use an idea from philosophy known as functionalism. Says that mental states are defined by their functional roles. In other words, what matters is what a state of the brain does, not what it physically is. For instance, it doesn't matter what causes you to believe that snow is white, whether it's an experience you had as a child or something you read in a book. What matters is what that belief does for you. It allows you to predict the future. If you see something white in the sky, you can predict that it will melt and that it's made of water. This is why we believe that mental states are really patterns of brain activity. It's because these patterns of brain activity play a functional role. They allow you to predict the future. But what functional role do the neural correlates of consciousness play? Well, according to functionalism, the function of conscious experience is to guide your behavior. Just like beliefs and desires guide your behavior, conscious experiences are also supposed to guide your behavior. But what exactly does this mean? Well, that's the big question in my lab. We want to understand how conscious experience guides behavior. In the end, our goal is nothing less than a theory of everything. We want a single framework that can explain all of human knowledge and behavior. Such a theory will have to account for how the brain processes information, how that information is stored in the form of memories, how these memories guide our behavior, and ultimately how they give rise to conscious thought and experience. In short, we want to understand what it means to be human. Thanks to a university for supporting this video. If you would like to support this channel, please visit our website.